counterpart. He's Executive Director of the Contra Costa Transportation Authority. I met Randy when he was managing pavement at Caltrans, and I was building highways in the South Bay. And we both knew we had to do more. In a few short years, the Momentum Station testbed out in Contra Costa has put Randy and CCTA on the map. And we look forward to the opportunity to become a partner with Momentum Station. Randy has become a leader in bringing autonomous vehicle technology to the masses. He has almost as many miles as Dr. Chris. He travels all around the world and talks about the things that they've been able to do and that we all should be looking towards in terms of changes in mobility. Please join me in welcoming a man on a mission to change the world, and he's going to have a great panel discussion for us this morning. Randy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting all of us to be here today. We appreciate it. This is second year. Congratulations. I know it takes a lot of time and a lot of work. Congratulations to the team. We do one of these every year, and it's satisfying at the end. It's a pain initially. So congratulations to all of you. And thank you to the panel members for being here today. We're going to talk a little bit about self-driving cars and how making emerging technology work for Marin County. I think that's very important on how to apply technology to make the county better. We're trying to do that for Contra Costa County, and I think Diane and her team, we work together to make sure that if we see things that are working well in Contra Costa, they should be able to work well in Marin as well. So we have 5 speakers. Miollie, D'Agostino, they're all going to take 2 minutes to tell you a little bit about themselves and why they're here and why it's important that they're here. So Miollie comes from UC Davis. Sam Arons, to my right, he's the sustainability manager for Lyft, but he spent some time in other organizations that are equally important. And so I think he's going to talk to you a little bit about that. And Hinton is very important. She works for AARP, and I'm an AARP member. So I want to make sure she talks about what I need to do when I'm not retired but working slower. And Steve Kinsey, my old friend, he used to be a supervisor here, you all know him, and Habib Shamskhou with Advanced Mobility Group. So Habib, why don't you start? 2 minutes, tell everybody here who you are and why you're here.
Sure, I'm not going to take 2 minutes because my bio is in your pamphlet. I'm the program director for Momentum Station program, and my expertise for 30 years is facilitation between private sector and public sector in advanced technology, and I'm looking for a lively discussion.
Great. So I'm here because I recognize that we really need to strengthen our communities in sustainable ways, and this idea of integrating technology with mobility is an important way to do that. I'm also here because I'm excited about the idea that these kind of events open our minds to new ways of thinking. And I encourage all of us to be thinking imaginatively about this because it's an opportunity to bring together Marin's long-standing commitment to environmental values with technology, but also we have a tremendously pressing need to create equity. And if we're not careful, this revolution will be destructive. So I'm here to also be protective of the quality of life for our community.
Great.
Miollie?
Yeah, my name is Miollie D'Agostino. I'm with the UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies and the Policy Institute for Energy, Transportation, and the Environment. So my role is a policy director of the new 3 Revolutions Future Mobility Program. Those 3 revolutions are shared electric automated travel. I think I see a couple familiar faces and some people that may have attended our conference last year. So you're familiar with the concept. But our goal is really to maximize the societal and environmental benefits of these 3 revolutions. So how do we see them occurring, and how do we make sure that that self-driving technology can benefit our communities? So that's where I'll leave it. And yeah, thanks.
Before you introduce yourself, did you bring any of Professor Sperling's book for the audience?
Ooh. I actually intended to, and yes, no books on site, but if you reach out, I can give you a discount code and buy one.
So there you go. It was worth coming today. All right. Okay, sorry, Ann.
No, that's okay. My name's Ann Hinton. I am 70 years old, and for 50 of those 70 years, I've worked with older adults and adults with disabilities. My last position was head of the Department of Aging and Adult Services for the City and County of San Francisco, and that was about 2 years ago. Since my retirement, I've been doing a number of things, but one of the most interesting has been volunteering with AARP on their Age-Friendly Communities Initiative, which includes, of course, transportation. And then as part of that, I was asked to be the chairperson of a task force work group that's across the country looking at AVs. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for the invitation.
All right, well, hey everyone. My name is Sam Arons. I'm the Director of Sustainability at Lyft. Prior to Lyft, I've actually spent 10 years at Google working on renewable energy supply for the data centers as part of the team that got Google to 100% renewable in 2017. My first order of business at Lyft was to make Lyft carbon neutral, and we're actually very excited to announce in April that all Lyft rides are now carbon neutral, which means that they have no net impact on the climate. Yeah, you can clap, thank you. And I'm excited to be here today to tell you about not only more details about that, what our plans are for EVs, AVs, and shared rides. And I'll just end by saying that we're very excited to announce yesterday a redesign of the passenger app. So the Lyft app that you have, it'll start getting rolled out in the next month or so to all users. But basically the redesign has a focus on shared rides, so it puts shared rides front and center to make it more likely that people will choose that. We have a goal of getting to 50% shared rides by the end of 2020. And, thank you, yeah, that's great. And the other exciting thing is that we will actually now have transit integration within the app. And Marin County is one of our two first partners that we will launch that transit integration with. So we're very excited to be here.
Yeah, that's great.
So the first question that we asked on the polling question was how many of you would use an autonomous vehicle? And it's in Marin County, it's exactly the opposite. Now, how many of you want to take an autonomous vehicle, but you still want somebody there to take over just in case? And don't be shy, raise your hand. So there's what do you say, maybe, let's call it 50%. So the Pew Institute did a study a couple of years ago, and about 87% of those polled wanted a human to take over a self-driving vehicle. And so we have received the first license in California for a level 4 vehicle. It's our shared autonomous vehicle. It's being tested in the city of San Ramon. And along those lines, I asked the manufacturer of the vehicle, Francois Ligier, Habib and I called him, and he said, well, I asked him a question, can you put a steering wheel in the vehicle for me? Because 87% of adults want to make sure that somebody's there to take over. And he said, why would I put a steering wheel in a vehicle that drives itself? And so I said, so the answer is no. He goes, yeah, I'm not going to put a steering wheel in a self-driving vehicle. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But I'm enthused by this area's response on that. And so maybe our first discussion is, and Sam, let's let you start, is what do you have in store? Because you've kind of let the cat out of the bag here. What do you have in store for Marin County, and why is it so important for Marin County in the area of the connected autonomous vehicle of the future?
Yeah, so I think, prior to yesterday's announcement about the transit integration, we actually already had a partnership with TAM here in Marin County for a transit partnership. So basically with the Smart Train for the stations that are within Marin County, you can actually take a Lyft ride that is subsidized at $5 per ride, as long as it's a shared ride, to and from those train stations. And so that, I just heard recently, had a huge uptick in ridership or usage just in March. I think another 1,000 riders per day were added. So we're all very excited about that. But that's just the very first step, right? So as we have this new app coming out, we will have the transit integration directly built into the app. So you just say, I want to go from point A to point B, and it will say, well, first take a Lyft to the train station, then take the Smart Train down to here, then take a Lyft over to where you're going. So it's all built in, all the planning, just makes it easy. But that, too, is just a very first step, because coming down the pipeline, of course, are the autonomous vehicles as well. And we actually have a two-pronged approach to AV. We have our own development initiative. It's based in Palo Alto. It's called Level 5. And we're designing hardware and software of our own. And then we also have partners who have their own AV technology that can use their technology on our platform. And we have an initial pilot of that in Boston and another one in Las Vegas at the moment. So I think that as the technology continues to develop, we will see it come onto the market. And we believe that within 5 years, probably 50% of rides given will be with autonomous vehicles. And that will be true here in Marin as well for the transit partnership that we have.
And where are you testing some of these vehicles? Are you testing them at Momentum Station?
Yes, we are.
Sure.
That's right.
Fantastic. Ann, so what do you have to say about that?
So AARP, those of you that don't know, we're a membership organization of about 38 million people across the country. And in California, it's about 3.4 million, so it's a whole lot of folks. In addition, we are the partner with the World Health Organization on age-friendly communities. And as I said earlier, you can't really look at that and not include transportation. And that is a matter of whether you're in suburban, urban, or rural communities. Transportation is a major issue. AARP has been involved in training on vehicle safety, driver safety for many, many years. It's, I think, the largest one in the country. And in addition to that, I was just looking at some stats the other day, and about 40 million Americans who are 65 and older have driver's licenses, but most of them will outlive their ability to drive a car by about 10 years. So, when you look at all of that and you think about the consequences of not driving, especially I think in rural communities, which I'm from South Dakota originally, so I really get that. The consequences related to health, social isolation, and other things, although you can have those in cities too, don't get me wrong. But at least there we have some access to public transportation. Rural communities don't have that kind of access. So I think those are the reasons we've gotten involved, and I would also say that we just have a far-thinking head of our AARP California who really has recognized that this is an issue that many members are interested in various communities, not just in California, but certainly across the country, actually. It's coming up in the livable community work.
Yeah, the silver tsunami is approaching as our population ages, and as we get older, we get afflicted with things that we wouldn't have got afflicted with because normally we would have passed away a long time ago as we live longer. And when you define underserved it's not always just the folks that don't have a car, it's the elderly, right? And it's also the disabled. And so this technology has a great opportunity, if used right, to provide access to those underserved portions of our community that I hear a lot about.
And I would just say in the last couple of weeks, I've had a stepson go in for one surgery and a sister go in for another surgery, and I was preparing for 2 or 3 different business things that I needed to be involved in. And really, it was the first time I said to myself, I could use an AV, right? If I could have been in a car preparing my work while somebody was getting me to all these other places, it would have made my life so much easier. So we don't want to forget about caregivers as well, and that would be caregivers, really across the age spectrum. So you're right. Yeah.
So Molly, along those lines, UC Davis, your research, the case, connected autonomous shared electric.
Sure. So, and I was talking to Ann prior. We get a lot of submissions for what is the fourth revolution. It's really hard to pick because there are, of course, more than 3 happening here. And it's possible this silver tsunami is this fourth revolution, or we're also compelled by this idea of on-demand delivery. But, anyway, moving towards that, I think, we really want to see these 3 revolutions delivering more mobility. We want to remove this frame that increased travel is a bad thing, right? And in the world of sort of the progressive transportation community, we're working so hard to reduce VMT. But the reality is we want to increase PMT, we want to increase passenger miles traveled. We want to make sure people can get where they need to go. There's so much latent demand for travel from the aging community, as well as from the disabled community, as well as from young and low-income people. So I mean, there's so much opportunity here to reduce the cost of travel to the extent that we can increase mobility, and I think that's our goal. So we need to just really be laser focused with that and ensure that our price signals are sending that message, that we want to make travel cheaper for everyone, but we want to make single occupancy vehicle travel the most expensive, so that we can make travel cheaper for everyone. I guess we can dig into that a little bit later, but yeah, that's the message.
So pricing schemes are going to be important in the future from a regulatory perspective.
Oh, absolutely, and they will be.
Steve, you have?
Yeah, I have some things to say. I think that, I'm pleased to be here on a technology-based discussion, but Alta is an active transportation firm, a national leader in that for the last 20 years. And we have a people-first philosophy, and if we're going to really make technology work for us, it really needs to respond to, not to control the thoughts of the public. The other thing is that I think that local governments and policy leaders need to embrace this public-private relationship. This is the emerging way in which mobility is going to be managed in the future. Although I was very concerned by the prediction of our last panel that transit as we know it today is going to be gone in 20 years. Transit and autonomous vehicles have a shared future, and if they don't, we have a real problem because we'll be delegating mobility to a select group as opposed to the whole community. Those are things that are concerning to me. I also think that in the world of proprietary information, communities are missing out on the data that's gathered by these companies, and we need to develop a partnership relationship that shares the data so that we can learn more about where people want to be, how they want to get to places, where are the hot spots, how can we work together between the public agencies' interests, health and welfare of our community, equity goals so that everyone has it. If we're all going to work off of a mobile device, we need to make sure everyone has a mobile device and can afford that mobile device. If communities are going to be served by these private companies, we've got to make sure that the communities of concern have equal access to this mobility as the communities of privilege. So there are a number of things that we're going to have to do to make this work, but the reality is it's coming. And I think that we should embrace it as long as we can hold it in a holistic way that recognizes that we really shouldn't be starting our AV platforms with fossil fuels. We should be starting them with the clean fuels so that we go forward. There are a number of ways that we can make AVs work for us, not us for them.
Yep.
Habib?
Why? There's too much to talk about. I want to pick up on what Sam said 5 years from now, that 50% of the cars are going to be AV equipped. I want to put it in perspective for you that what you should expect to see in the next 5 years. We believe, based on what we know, that the 50% of the functionality that today's to human being use in a car is going to go away. Not 100% of that by 5 years. We got a long way to go before we have a level 4 and 5 cars in our highway system. I have a lot more to talk about that, where the future holds with the autonomous car. We believe that the under 25 mile per hour share autonomous vehicle shuttles are going to be a reality in our streets. In next 5-6 years, you're going to see it in our community, moving the people and addressing the issue of our transit accessibility and first mile, last mile going forward. That's important to put in perspective. Transit accessibility is going to be key because as of today, still in our entire countries, only 7% of the people use transit. And the sad news is that in the last 30 years that we tracking a statistic, that number has gone down to 6.8%. With all this talk about the transit, that's the reality. That's where we are. So the disadvantaged community and the older people are going to be first beneficiary of the autonomous vehicle in the next 5 years, specifically more in the safety part of it. The cars of the future is going to be much more safer. And I also have to prepare you for the next few years that what you should expect to hear. You hear all the time, every 2 months, you're going to hear one major accident by autonomous car. You have to, when you hear those news, you have to put it in perspective.
I haven't asked that question yet.
Oh, you haven't asked. Okay, we get that. We get that to that question.
Go ahead, keep going. You're answering that. Yeah, go. You're good.
Every day, 110 people get killed in the highway. Last hours that we had this session, 5 people got killed in our highway system. Yet, only when you have a multi-car accident, you hear it in the news. But you should expect that if there is a little incident with autonomous car, it's going to be blown out of proportion nationally. But when you hear that, you have to put it in perspective. Cars of the future is going to be 90% much safer than today's. This is a killing machine that we are driving. So when you hear all this news, put it in perspective. Safety is going to be a biggest benefit that you're going to have on the advanced vehicle control system with the cars of the next 5 years. By 2022, all the cars have to have, the new cars have to have the safety features in there of the autonomous vehicle.
By the way, if you have a question or you have a comment, please raise your hand or say something, because we're going to move on to the next question. Yes?
If 90% of the cars if the cars could be 90% safer, will that drive change in the design and the hardware that a car is, e.g. could it be lighter, less, I mean, there's so many features that are built into cars today that are around protecting us in the event of an accident. So if you've...
Yes, I'm glad that you asked that question. Today, autonomous cars, this is what you need to know in the era of the AI and the future. Today's autonomous car, perhaps they have 20 to 30 sensors built into the bumpers or so. Future's car in 5 to 8 years from now, they are going to have 800 sensors. 800 sensors. And it's going to be 2/3 lighter as we grow with this new machine. It's not going to be called this car anymore. It's going to be something new that is totally different than what we know of today. But this is an evolutionary process, one step out of time, as we reduce the functionality that we do as a human being. I can see that 3 years from now, you drive from here to Southern California, that you could get your hands off the wheel and look at your monitor, cell phone, and other things moving forward. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be 100% functionality. Still, to your local destination, you have to get the control of the wheel going to your home or other destination.
High-speed rail has the same issue, crash avoidance versus crash worthiness. So in California, it's a shared track. So you design the train in case if they hit something. Everywhere else, there's nothing ahead of them. It's high speed only. So the trains are lighter, they use less energy. So along the area of safety, does anybody else have any comments on this notion or this promise of greater safety? I know, Steve, you have a point on, do you have it on where AVs interact with bicycles, pedestrians, and things like that?
Sure. I say let's hold on to owning the curb. Bicycles and pedestrians are going to need to be assured that we have more space on the road, that those double-parked ride-hailing companies don't prevent the free flow of bicycles, that there's easily and clearly accessible routes to these mobility hubs, which we want. We want the interconnection. We don't want to diminish the value of autonomous vehicles, but we want them to work in an environment where we celebrate walking and biking as a preferred way in our downtown areas.
Yes. Sam's going to add a point, then we're going to come to your point.
Just add a very small point. So we've actually been doing a pilot in San Francisco on Valencia Street, if anybody's familiar with that. Very busy pedestrian area and bike area and all sorts of stuff happening on that street, where we have been having pick up and drop off. People are directed to a side street. So it's, a 20-yard walk, or something, not very far. You just walk around the corner and get off the main drag, so you're not having drivers being double parked in bike lanes and things like that. So that's been very successful, actually, and that's going to be rolled out in a much broader way in this new version of the app, so that we can finally, take back that curve.
I've ridden the slow-speed shuttle around Gomentum Station. We've got much more challenging environments here in Marin. And so in order to be able to connect with our downtowns, I'm in Fairfax, so we've got a nice route into downtown. We could certainly imagine someday our current parking area in the middle of town being a transit hub, but still getting up into all those narrow little side streets. And this was a question that was asked earlier. In terms of predicting the future, how soon will we see something that could serve as a shuttle and maybe learn those streets and be able to do it? But, these are narrow streets where humans stop and interact and sometimes even back up and get out of each other's way in order to get up those roads. So how soon are we going to have a shuttle that can do that?
Good. Sure.
Well, I was going to say, I think technology will get us there, but our roads aren't going to get us there, right? I mean, this technology is about making sure that we don't have potholes and we have street signs. And I don't know, how many communities have you driven in that have all of that down to a T? So I don't mean to, you all are the experts in that other side, but there's some things we have to do as communities if we want that, that we invest in some of these other things to get there.
Again, I want to put it in perspective of the first mile, last mile. I said that 90% of our citizens, they don't have the access to simple bus stop. Take it nationwide. So in the United States, we only use 7% transit. European Union, 46% they use the transit. Or so. The issue of the narrow street, the challenging environment, you have to put it in the perspective of the evolutionary process, that if we could achieve only the 10% in the transit accessibility, that's a huge, huge deal in the next 5-8 years. We may not going to be address all the environmental conditions and the possible case scenario. Maybe the people have to walk to a main roadway for 2 blocks in order to have access to those. But as we go through the process in the next 50 years, every one of those challenges is going to be addressed. The other things that I did want to let you know, and everybody be aware of it, that all the companies that we are working with at the Gomentum Station, they developing the technology to be independent of the infrastructure features that are highly desirable. If you want to have an infrastructure that is highly desirable, even 80 years from now, you are not going to have it because you're dealing with the 8,000 jurisdictions in the United States, and every one of them, nobody can force them to change their environment to your liking. Yeah.
So what you see now is, as an issue, policies could potentially change that by restricting the access on those streets in the future. So there's policy that goes with the technology.
Right.
And so that's what I think people are trying to make sure that they keep up the policies with the technology. And so you could restrict large vehicles, haul people down the hill, have them assemble in a certain area, and the parking structure could be somewhere else. So there's a lot of opportunity. But so the question about the technology, it's a few years away because it's very difficult for these slow-speed shuttles to make a left-hand turn.
Thank you.
Way too many questions.
Hi there. I was wondering if any of you in your work have come across discussions concerning possible regulatory frameworks for how AVs, automatic vehicles, and electric vehicles are going to interact with, human-piloted, gas-powered cars, because they're going to be mixed in, probably for some period. And if there's been any discussion about policy in terms of incentives, especially for those who couldn't afford a brand new car or with new technology like that, a buyback program. And I guess the other facet of that is the materials required to make a new car. I mean, all AVs, they're going to be new cars, which we know the carbon footprint of over the entire life cycle of a new car, even if it's like a Tesla, might be larger than just buying a used car and not driving it very much. So I'm wondering if that's been in any of your discussions, how they're going to interact, what kind of regulatory frameworks are going to get people to switch, and how they're going to, work together.
That's a lot of questions in one person. So let's take the materials. Chris, you want to take that one? You can answer?
You can pop in. One thing we have to remember is we flip over our fleet between 13 and 20 years. It depends on how you look at it. So that's a good question, and within 20 years, every single vehicle will have AV embedded within it to some degree. If you have a car right now, which beeps when you back up or go forward, get too close, you already have a certain type of autonomy built into it, just to say. So, in some cars, you'll push a button and it can follow the car in front of you, it'll park for itself. So we're on our way with that already, and therefore the footprint issue is a good question, but one thing, there's two things I think that's really important with that is the new shared vehicle types. So I think one of the things we haven't mentioned, or maybe you did, I missed it, but we can't be thinking of this as just like a 2-seater, 4-seater, but most of the OEMs, the car manufacturers, and new entrants are looking at new types of vehicles, completely new from the ground up. So we could have a Marin bus, the Marin Transit, which is a completely different typology, which fits for us. That could then go for routes. I think that's something we can't forget. Don't just think of like the little Tesla. And then the new protocols. It's going to be interesting to see, and this is where legislation comes into play, and interesting to hear what you think, or what are some of the new protocols we need to be thinking about during this transition phase? Right? Because this is going to be the sloppy phase, where eventually we won't need traffic lights, right? In 25, 30 years, we're going to look back with wonder at these silly things that we call traffic lights.
They really irritate everybody here, by the way.
Absolutely, yeah. Living in Mill Valley, well done, folks. That was like, But seriously, so we got to look back, and we're going to get rid of this. So a lot of this signage, et cetera, it'll probably become redundant in a very fascinating way. But that transition, any thoughts on that, to me, is where we really have to be thinking about to help make sure we're not getting in the way of ourselves making progress.
Molly, that sounds like right up your alley.
So one of the things that I wanted to mention, so this is jumping ahead a little bit, is this recent CPUC decision that some people may have heard about that would restrict testing of AV vehicle fleets to those rides being free. There's a couple other aspects of the legislation. All rides would be free in these testing of AV fleets. All rides would be for a single party, so not a solo occupant necessarily, but a single reserved party, so natural pooling, but no genuine ride pooling. And a couple other interesting aspects of that ruling. And I think that really gets to the point that right now it's kind of sloppy, because that is sort of counter to most of the existing knowledge on this subject. And it reflects the fact that, and I by no means am criticizing those involved. I think we all have a lot of learning to do to figure out how to best regulate AV fleets. I don't think the solution is free and solo occupant, but neither do I know what it is. So I think we need to, to take a moment to think through what that will look like, and also acknowledge that we're very price sensitive, and so when you provide something free that we know is going to be a better product, it could produce some dangerous unintended consequences. And we know that. This is basic economics. This is nothing new. And so I think it really is sending a really dangerous message but then I'll add that at the same time, there's also been a lot of discussion, and it was discussed in the previous panel, about the fact that maybe some AV fleets will be free because of ad revenue. And there's some internal debate in my program and amongst, so I won't say there's a consensus on this subject, but I think we really do need to consider what that would mean if AVs are free, and then as a result they're funded by advertising, how that could affect the user experience and how it could affect our travel and create some other unintended consequences. So not to mention, will it pencil, because of the fact that advertising is very, very cheap. So, so I think there's some real challenges there that making free travel in automated vehicle fleets a little, we're not sure if that's the right approach.
So CPUC's coming out to Gomentum Station to understand the rulings and how it affects, because a lot of them never ridden in a fully autonomous vehicle before. In fact, other than you, sir, a lot of people here haven't ridden in a level 4 vehicle ever in their life. There's not a lot of people. So CPUC's coming out, take a look and experience that. Business model-wise, the current, our shared autonomous vehicle that we rolled out in San Ramon, it's paid for by the private sector. The public sector is overseeing that, but not the transit agency. So we had access to 4 vehicles. We have 2. The third one is now in the United States, went through customs, uncrated. It's going to the city of Dublin into another county. And we're going to test that, and it's going to be overseen by LAVTA, Livermore Amador Valley Transit Authority, and also County Connection, Contra Costa's main transit provider in the central part of Contra Costa. It's going to be a public-private partnership or kind of an agreement. So now the public sector transit operators will get an understanding of how those vehicles operate, to understand how to price it, and those kinds of things. So at the end of the day, someone's going to have to make money to afford these things, these vehicles. The last thing I would say is the electric motor, there's 18 moving parts versus an internal combustion engine has about 1,500. They're designing the next generation of vehicles to last about 500,000 miles. You drive maybe 5,000, 7,000, 10,000 miles a year. You're not going to keep plus it's parked 95% of the time. You're probably not going to buy a vehicle that's going to last 50 years. It's not going to happen. So they're going to be more, just by the sheer length and the cost, they're going to have to be used in some kind of commercial application initially. Is that correct, Chris? Is that your research? Yeah. So.
Can I add something to
Sure.
that very quickly? Because
It's a great crowd, by the way.
Respectfully, I want to disagree with the promises of the question and your comment on that, because you shouldn't underestimate the massive capability of the technology. We know of the many companies are already in mainland China and here in the United States working on retrofitting the existing car to have autonomous vehicle functionality. So we don't have to wait for the full penetration of the autonomous car to be effective. What you need to know, because there are a lot of policymakers, decision makers in the room and government officials, I want to bring your attention. What does all of this mean to Marin County? What you need to know is that your problem in 101, none of this technology is going to put a dent on your problem in the congestion in 101. That is something that you need to know, and you need to plan accordingly. The second most important thing is that what you have to plan accordingly is that the negative impact of the disruptive technology. That is going to have huge impact in your community. If you don't embrace the technology, don't be proactive, don't work with the private sector, you're going to see, like downtown San Francisco, that the TNC is a cause of the 8% traffic increase in downtown. So think about that. Also think about the unit that you have in this is a retrofit. The unit that you have in your hand is not the unit that you bought in the store 6 months ago or 2 years ago. It has been updated at least 20 times. So your car is going to be constantly updated as you're going to use it. Your car is going to be third largest mobile device. So keep all these things in perspective.
The microphone's back there. We'll get to you.
I'm a great believer in automated vehicles. One of the big concerns I have is a lot of people are scared of them, indicated by the show of hands of people who want a steering wheel in them. So I'm concerned about how this thing gets rolled out. And I would hope that the people that are testing this thing and the people that implement it would put it into a community that's very simple to be able to use automated vehicles, and they would limit it greatly, and so that we can see some test results. I'm a great believer in crawl before you walk, before you run. And I think by doing what Tesla's doing with their cars, they've had several bad accidents. That's going to just make the public more apprehensive about using these vehicles.
And we get asked every now and then the difference between testing on public streets and testing in a controlled environment. And some companies choose to test their fully autonomous technology in a controlled environment first, and then ultimately we'll roll it on the streets. So it's a different philosophy versus driving on the streets and then something happening and then coming to a test bed. I think there's a place for both. You don't see the noise that you would see at an intersection that you take for granted when you drive your vehicle, but the computer sees, the car sees everything, all the motion, all the shadowing, all the moving shadowing, it sees everything, and that's hard to simulate in a controlled environment. So take your vehicle out, have a human driver, take a look at that, and then model it into the future. That's, I think, the direction. Steve, you want to?
Yeah, you know, earlier speaker talked about one end of the spectrum is fear and the other end of the spectrum is hope. And from my perspective, what will bring those two together is significant community engagement, a real honest conversation about where we want this to go. And I think that demonstration projects are really important. Look for ones that have a low risk and a high reward, that have great visibility with the public, and be able to monitor that and build and leverage your community understanding before you impose it on them in a way that frightens them, so pushes them over to the fear side. I also think that we need to make sure that these projects that we roll out as early examples have an economic sensibility so that the community doesn't begin to see this as really just a kind of a fad for affluence to be indulged in. And I also think that this idea of learning as we go, there are so many wonderful examples already. You know, Europe is far ahead of the US in this. Communities like Seattle, a major exercise that's going on in Cincinnati where Uber is really opening their books and opening their data and sharing their information. We need to learn from the learning of others at the same time.
Sam, not to put you on the spot, but do you have any thoughts on this? The walking before you, or crawling before you walk?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, you know, certainly there's a, you know, despite what the data shows, which is that actually AVs are significantly safer than a human-operated vehicle, there's a very important public perception aspect to this, and that's very important to pay attention to, because I think, you know, we all need to get comfortable with this and feel pretty certain that this is actually going to work and it's going to be safe, and so that's why we are doing our testing with Gomentum. And eventually, you know, we will be bringing it out to public roads, but we want to be very cautious, certainly.
Okay, you've been waiting.
It's so exciting to have future thinkers here. When I think about all of us that live on a shoreline, especially in Marin County, is there anything about these future cars that will also be able to travel in water?
We have been, yeah.
I would be happy to answer that in the bigger perspective that you hear in the news about the flying taxi. You hear about a lot of other stuff. Ain't gonna happen. Flying taxi, you may have a few of them for the leisure in the desert of Dubai, but not in San Francisco Bay Area in the next 25 years or next 50 years that I know. The concept of the car that could also have a dual use in the water as well as in the land has been around for 50 years, and there are a lot of movie that you have seen about that, and it's also working, but it's functional. To be functional, I don't see it in the near future. And I also want to, I hear everybody is so concerned about the social impacts and the societal impact of these, how can be equity built into this. At the end of the day, the companies that they are doing this massively, which is a lot of them, 165 in our Gomentum station ecosystem, they're only thinking about monetizing this. Believe it or not, they are only thinking about monetizing. It's up to us that how we adopt the technology that doesn't have that negative impact in our community moving forward.
Molly, any research on
Automated shipping?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know enough about it to really be an expert or anything, but there are already automated ships, and, you know, there is a growing industry there. So I think that whether it can be for passenger travel, I think remains to be seen. I think there was some discussion, I think it's really just early stages, about a ferry, automated ferry service, but I think it has such limited location, you know, use cases that it's hard to see the type of innovation that you've seen within the AV space.
I'm thinking about, all of a sudden, Highway 37 is flooded, and you've got your vehicle, and can you just shift gears, so to speak, and make it through the water system to the sea level rise, temporary? That's what, I didn't word that very well.
Yeah, I have, in all of our partnerships, all of our discussions, we have not come across a manufacturer that wants to build a vehicle that drives on the street and then goes in the water and then comes back out again. Well, first, you know, so hydrofoils, yes. You can do some, James Bond had a nice vehicle that went down below. And I mean, that stuff is imaginable and it's possible, but you have to worry about things like turbidity in the water. You know, you got BCDC, these other things that you're going to, as you enter the water, if you're entering from the shoreline, you're going to create some impacts from the biology and things like that. So you're going to have to mitigate all that. So it's not just developing a car that floats and drives and the wheels paddle. That could be done. It's all these other issues that you might have to overcome and mitigate that it may not pan out. Does that make sense?
Well, sure, but building the Highway 37 in
The good
that
news
area
is-
also to have to mitigate that.
The great news is RM3, that just recently was passed here in the Bay Area, has money for ferry operations.
Great.
That's true.
And
Yeah.
Highway 37.
And Highway 37.
Thank you. Ideally, land use and transportation planning go together. And I guess the vehicles, cars, gave us suburbia and a lot of movement out. So I'm asking you to think like futurists. What do you see? Maybe it's a question for the next 50 years with AVs. What are we going to get in terms of land use, and how is that going to really give us a better future?
Sam?
Yeah, I would say you know, our vision at Lyft that we're working towards is a future where cities are reclaimed for people and from cars. And you know, yeah. And Randy alluded to this earlier, but you know, the typical privately owned vehicle today is used 4% of the time, and it's parked 96% of the time. So really, these are parking machines. They're not really driving machines. And we have something like 700 million parking spaces in the United States that take up an area of about 6,000 square miles, which is bigger than Connecticut. So we are devoting, you know, a massive amount of land to parking, not to mention, you know, freeways of ever-expanding numbers of lanes, and, you know, the sort of sprawl that comes with that. And so, but we have to be very thoughtful because, and I'm maybe stealing your thunder a little bit from Three Revolutions, but we need to be cautious as we think about this future because there can be sort of a very good scenario of autonomous vehicles, and there can be a very bad scenario. And if you imagine, you know, lots of privately owned autonomous vehicles, well, hey, now, you know, instead of living in Livermore or Tracy or somewhere and trying to commute to San Francisco, which people are already doing, now I might live in, you know, Truckee, or I might live in, you know, Ukiah, or, you know, somewhere even farther away. And so now suddenly you have even more sprawl that's happening. And not to mention, when I get to my job finally, I don't want to pay for parking in San Francisco, it's expensive, so I'm just going to have my car drive around the streets for 8 hours with nobody in it, and that will also create more congestion. So we have to be very cautious that as these autonomous vehicles come to be, that we are making sure they are really being used in a shared and sort of pooled way. And as we do that, that will actually reduce congestion, it will reduce the need for parking, and we can actually start to reclaim streets for pedestrians and parks, and, you know, build communities rather than building parking lots everywhere.
And Molly?
So some of this goes back to the earlier question, I think, about regulation as well. And I was thinking about public policy when you made your last comment. So one of the things that somebody else up here could speak to in greater detail, but, you know, the feds have responsibility for a certain amount of regulation related to how we transport ourselves. And the state has another, you know, handle on that. And recently I spoke to people at DMV here, and of all the states that are working in this space, California seems to have done the most work in the regulation area. And I'm understanding, Randy, that it's just recently, though, that the state has gotten involved with the counties to actually have partnerships there. But I think, this, and someone else earlier said this thing about the private and public partnerships. I would want to increase that to nonprofit and consumer partnerships. So maybe at the local level, the public policy around, do you get to circle, right? What do you do in your own communities is just one of those things that people need to be thinking about and start to determine, because that probably is a local issue, right? I mean, our streets, how we park, where we park, who's going to have the who's going to be closest to the curb, who's going to be in the center. That's all our local decisions. So getting involved in that area seems to me to be a pretty important thing. But it's also about understanding what those other levels of government are supposed to be doing that they may or may not be doing at this point.
Molly? Do you have any thunder left? Sam stole it?
So many, but yes.
Sorry.
No, this is such a great conversation. I mean, the public-private partnerships issue, I think, is something that deserves some more research. And one of our researchers, Susan Pike, is trying to do a meta-analysis of some of these partnerships as they unfold. We've compiled a list of around 60 public-private partnerships, and I have a little cheat sheet. Then 20 of them we're going to complement transit. 16 of them are addressing the first last mile connectivity. So that, of course, there may be some overlap there too, and then a number of others that have other focuses. So obviously, those are worthwhile focuses, right? So, and in other cases, you're actually seeing some actual duplication or just removal of existing fixed route and replacing it with some of these partnerships. But I think as these partnerships emerge, and this analysis is not done, so it's really mid stages. But our initial thoughts are sort of how do we make sure that the partnerships really are win-wins for the public sector and the private sector and the community, and then also they're really laser focused on partnering with the right type of private partners that are focused on the community and public objectives. So it's not just about making profit and offsetting the cost of transit, but really which companies are willing to say our goal is also to improve mobility for the disabled, and then partnering on those, because there's going to be a huge number of different private partners available. And so public sector people might be able to get a little more picky with who they get to partner with and why, and focus on the goals. So I think that's the early stages of this research, and we'll be able to release more in the summer, fall.
From a transportation and land use perspective, which was raised, there are so many things that we should be thinking about, especially in a community like Marin, which is primarily suburban. Once autonomous vehicles are rolling, this idea of micro-transit, moving through those hills, gathering people up. At the same time, just like Lyft has already recognized that if you'll find a micro hub, it's easier than having to stop on every road or double stopping on busy streets. So starting that conversation within the suburban areas about where you could create these collection points that work for the surrounding neighborhoods. Imagining a future where garages are now available for habitable space and what we could do to address some of our housing crises associated with that. Reinforcing the idea of mixed use, even in suburban neighborhoods, so that services that we otherwise use, we could get to by walking or biking. We don't need AVs to actually get around everywhere. AVs should be connected with, and they are connected with, the idea of joined with biking and walking. And we're seeing Lyft, we're seeing Uber capture these bike share programs because they recognize that the connectivity of the different modes is really going to be the extra value added that is greater than the sum of the parts. Those are some of the land use aspects that I foresee.
You have some to add, Habib?
Very quickly related to the land use, I believe the technology impact of non-transportation is going to be much more bigger than the transportation or autonomous car, and that has got to do with the Amazon of the world and the Walmart of the world. Think about it, by the end of this year, 12 companies like the Toys R Us are going to be out of business and going to be out of the neighborhood. And if you have never heard the word reindustrial, get familiar with it. That's what's happening associated with the land use.
Who has a microphone this side? Okay, your question.
I was thinking about climate change and sea level rise, and we've been talking about that. And wildfire risk is really, really high in Marin, of course, and we have the windy roads. And if people don't have cars or they're sharing cars, we have AV. What is your vision of the future? How would technology help us evacuate in a situation like that?
It's a very good question.
Well, I can speak to Lyft's program called Relief Rides, which is actually a program where we donate rides in disaster situations to help people either evacuate or perhaps post-disaster, maybe you need to get around town and you lost your vehicle or something like that. And we actually just recently announced an expansion of that partnership with United Way to 12 different cities in the US. I think we just announced this on Tuesday, maybe, where essentially we are donating, tens of thousands of rides to folks around the country who may not have access to transit or to a vehicle or ways to get around, so to help veterans get around town, to help people get to job interviews or to non-emergency medical appointments. And so I think that program can help in disaster situations as well.
I'm working on a panel that is looking at resiliency, and a lot of times this is for state DOTs around the nation, so it's a Transportation Research Board panel, and we've added technology to that. How do we leverage our partners' ability to move a mass amount of people away from a disaster? So, and this goes to planning. So you've heard it a couple of times, but what we're trying to do in Contra Costa County is plan the future. You build these long-range transportation plans that are 25, 30. I think MTC's working on Plan 2050. So you're going a number of ways, but a lot of times the plans don't implement or take into account TN's transportation network companies and AV and connected vehicles of the future. And so you're getting a skewed look, you're getting a skewed model of the future. And those long-range plans develop your expenditure plan, your capital improvement plans that you're going to base your sales tax measures and your other things on, and that's what the voters are going to see. And so at least in my case, when I'm 70 years old, I want to be proud of the fact that we developed a plan for our county that implements technology. I love Diane talking about, at least in your proposed measure, that you have unattached dollars to leverage technology. We had that in our Measure X in 2016 because we know what we convinced the board was you don't know what technology is coming your way, but you should be ready for it. And that's a hard thing to sell staff-wise to elected officials because they're looking at you like you don't know what you're talking about. But in our case, there's this better, because of events like this, our elected officials are hearing from not just staff, but from these futurists that have more credibility sometimes than the staff. And that's why we love these events. And so they're telling you about the future, and we're just saying, that's right. So let me just say that we, in our case, are working on making sure the resiliency plans have technology to save our people. And we're really, really looking forward to that document.
And I would just add the World Disability Council, Anita Aaron, their office is in the East Bay. They have been working on this issue of the disasters and folks with disabilities, and I believe they're now going to get started in looking at how AVs can be helpful in that area too. So it might be another place to look for information.
Diane?
Thank you. We have a strong core of local elected officials here. We want to look at autonomous vehicle, microtransit, autonomous corridor. You talked very early on today about the features of an ideal corridor. Can you very briefly tell us the key stepping stones if we were going to try over the next year to implement some kind of an AV pilot corridor that is both shared and fuel efficient and congestion relieving and move us into this? What are our key steps we'd have to do?
Habib, you want to take that one on?
Well, if you put on the slides up, we can talk about it.
Yeah, Marin,
you
put
have
up
all
the
the
Moss
slides up?
slide.
One single slide. So everything that you should do and consider the demonstration project or any other project, it has got to do with the social impact. That means moving the people from the single occupant cars to the transit or other alternative transportation. And that's the result that you see a major movement in Europe and now coming to the United States called MaaS, Mobility as a Service. So all of your demonstration project, it has got to do with the picture that you see out there that is a MaaS, and we call this one the Bay Area MaaS, that on the top, it's all the apps and services that you have to provide with the people. On the bottom is all of the non-single occupant vehicle asset that you have to build on it. And you can see on the center, it does require a lot of, it does require a data hub, system integration, and facilitation in order to make it happen. We truly believe that the mobility as a service is the way of the future with the less dependency on the car, but from planning, programming, funding that and public officials are in here, you have to build into your plan, and I hope everybody in Marin County just get out and vote for the innovation program this November, that we could have real funding. More and more, when Randy talked about the regional transportation plan, I did a word search in few of these transportation plan. When it comes to the transit, it's just called promote, educate the public. That doesn't work. If we want to change this landscape, we have to provide the funding and do the projects that are not related to the moving the people with the single occupant cars. And these pictures speak volume in that where we are heading in the future. And extracting from that pictures, we can define a specific demonstration project where we can get the biggest bang for the buck as an early winner with the little investment. I use this example in Chicago, and I'm going to use it in here because many of you suffering from this problem in here. For 40 years, Europeans are experiencing and enjoying connection protection. In this country, in Marin County, we may have less than 3% in the connection protection. The bus is coming in and the other bus is leaving, you have to wait for another half an hour. That's happened to me all the time in San Francisco. That's a low-hanging fruit, something that we can do it, is less expensive, and we can have a more transit trip reliability in near term. And doesn't take a lot of money. That's just one example of the many.
I think funding, you're going to have to find a funding source, generally, Diane. You're going to have to find a city that supports innovation because they're going to have to pass some resolutions. In our case, the city of San Ramon had to pass a resolution because the transit agency is not running the low-speed shuttle service. It's deemed a jitney service, so the city had to pass resolutions for us in order to operate those vehicles on public streets in the city of San Ramon. Lower speed, lower volume, just because you don't want, we say that we're the second, we try to be there's a lot of firsts that we did, but the first that we didn't do is we didn't put a shared autonomous vehicle on public streets for the first in the United States. That was our goal, but we didn't make it. Las Vegas beat us by a couple of weeks. But we're the only shared autonomous vehicle on public streets today that haven't been hit yet. So our goal is to be first, but our real goal is to be the safest. I think that's why we love having Lyft as a partner, is that's their whole mantra, is safety. The safety for their clientele, safety for the testing, safety for the vehicles. And it's all about safety. Lower speed, and you're going to have to adapt some of your traffic infrastructure, like your controllers, your signal controllers. The city's going to have to adopt and be able to send information to that vehicle through a communication device inside that controller cabinet. That's why you need a city. So that's why we went to San Ramon, and we're really, really satisfied with the partnership. They're very accommodating, and they like the attention, and so that's how we selected. Plus, the value there is currently within that business park, they bring express buses in dropping people off at their place of work. But all around that business park, they can't park in that parking structures. So those buses in the morning coming from the BART stations are full. They go back to the BART stations empty. Imagine if they were half full. let's say they had 40 passengers per bus. That's 80 in each, or 40 in each direction of single occupant vehicles that no longer take up parking at either the BART stations or clog center-most streets. And that's a good day. And so that's why we selected that area.
So I'm going to actually just add a couple more things and build on that. If TAM wants to have a demonstration project going or work on a corridor plan in the next year, I agree with Randy. What you need is you need to identify a public policy body, a city, a town, council that wants it. You not only need to have them pass a resolution that embraces the technology, but also that embraces the delivery models of public and private partnerships. And this is where governments struggle. But that's also a key to some of that funding as well. And in that regard, you can never forget the public engagement piece of this. Again, I remind you that you need to bring your public along with you. You know, you need that partnership. You need to get the data that will be helpful. And finally, I would say, don't just think of it as how do we do a demonstration of AV. Think about the multimodality, because that's really what we're trying to do, is connect all modes and that last mile, first mile. So improve the walking and biking conditions in the corridor at the exact same time that you're working on the AV solutions.
Molly, she wants to ask, you want to?
Super quickly, I'm very interested in the AV future, how you're going to power all these vehicles. And earlier somebody was talking about how are we going to make this transition. Can anybody comment on like what's going to happen with the volatility of the world right now? Maybe gasoline is just going to go away. And simultaneously with the question of like, how do we move to electricity? How do we power with solar? And also, how do we power our smartphones? I can't tell you how many times I'm using my smartphone to try to find the next bus, and then I run out of power. So it's just a question of power. How are we powering this?
So we've recently got a grant from the Department of Energy and we've been trying to do this. What we've done is we reverse modeled how do we reach the 80% reduction goal by the year 2050. And in Contra Costa County, we need a 58% zero emission fleet turnover with a slight reduction by 2040. With a slight reduction in VMT per capita by 2040, and we'll glide into that 80% reduction, but it's all based on a zero-emission vehicle. So based on that, then the team said, oh my God, we need to have some kind of an electric vehicle readiness plan. So we recently got some dollars to start our study, and we'd love to partner with you. I know you may have wanted to get the grant, but we did. But there may be some transferable information. So we're trying to figure out how do we set the charging station grid. We've just signed an agreement with a company called Elix out at Gomentum Station. They use magnets to create energy. They spin things, and so it's all wireless. So you may not have to go to the sun or wherever, the wind. So this is another option, so we're testing that. So we want to make sure that when we lay out this grid to support Lyft's future electric vehicle fleet, that we're not rolling out the wrong technologies or old technologies, because that's what the procurement process does sometimes. So that's the plan. And we're excited about that plan. Do you have anything about your fleet?
Yeah, I might add. So, today, Lyft does not own any vehicles, right? I mean, it's drivers who are bringing their vehicles to the platform. And for the most part, those are fossil fuel vehicles, although some are electric. And the electric drivers are sort of figuring out on their own, how are they going to charge? But that's not a great way to do it if you want to scale this up. And so I was actually quite pleased to see another CPUC decision that came out just last week, putting aside, I think, about $800 million for charging in California, with some focus on passenger vehicles, some focus on sort of heavy, trucks and ports and things like that as well, which is also very important. Although interestingly, there had been a proposal by, I think it was PG&E, in the earlier priority review process, which proposed to do some charging specific to ride sharing, and that was actually rejected by the PUC. And I don't know all the reasons why that is, but I think as we kind of imagine a future where ride sharing becomes an increasing perhaps share of VMT and PMT, we do need to be very thoughtful about where will we put all these chargers, and we need to put them in places that make sense for ride sharing, right? I mean, if they're just in people's private, residential garages, that's not going to be very helpful. We actually need fast chargers in city centers so that people who are trying to make a living or trying to make some extra money doing this, driving, don't have to go take a 4-hour-long break somewhere out in the countryside before they come back and get back to work.
Right, and I'll just add, this is not on the energy grid side, but on the electrification of TNCs. Nancy Skinner has a bill, SB 1014, that would try to address this issue of, some of our highest usage vehicles are TNCs right now. Lyft and Uber's, being the largest companies, but there are others as well. And if we can electrify those vehicles, we're really going to get a lot of bang per buck. And so there's some discussion about how to do that, how to incentivize. The companies don't own the vehicles, as Sam said. So how do you incentivize the drivers to make the decision to electrify their vehicle? And there's lots of ways. We haven't really tried any. There hasn't been a strategic approach beyond the targeted efforts towards the full market. So I think there could be a lot that you could do there. You could really accomplish a lot if you targeted those drivers.
One more question. I think somebody has a mic over here. Yeah, you.
Along the lines of us being kind of a multi-typology as peoples, it seems to me there was something that came up with that our cars are more than just mobility vehicles. They're kind of little lifestyle boxes, right? They are phone booths. They are storage containers for our stuff. And they are insurance policies for the fluctuations in our life, the disaster preparedness or my life emergencies or my kid's emergency. And that I shift during the day between dropping my kid off, maybe going to a gym, maybe going to work, then to the hospital or something like that. So how do you think of these vehicles as this kind of lifestyle box, not just a mobility box? So it's not just mobility as a service, but it's a life container as a service.
I would be happy to address that. Just think about your smartphone that you have, which almost 95%, perhaps 100% of us, we have it in this room right now. 5 years ago, we had flip-flop. Just not too long. 5 years ago, we had the flip-flop. And this smartphone every year is 400% much smarter than the previous year. You are still going to be able to do all the function that you used to do with your existing car. It's just going to make it easier for you, for everything that you do. There is no reason our next generation are going to laugh at us that we have spent so much time behind the wheel. That's the key point here.
Anything else on that, real quick?
I might just add that we actually see the future of transportation as really a subscription service. We're all collectively spending in this country $2 trillion a year on our private vehicles, which is more than we spend on food, by the way. And that works out to about $9,000 per vehicle per year. And as we see autonomy coming into being and the cost of shared autonomous rides drops, the value proposition is going to be pretty obvious. It's going to be, why would I spend $9,000 per year on this vehicle when I can spend much less than that on a subscription service with a company like Lyft? And I can just tap a button and I can get to the hospital and to pick up my kids and to the gym and all the places I want to go. I don't have to deal with this parking machine that I otherwise have to deal with.
10 cents a mile. Remember that number, 10 cents a mile. Thank you.
Yeah, hey, this is just great. Randy, members of the panel, thank you so much. Useful discussion, and we look forward to keeping on working with many of you as we move forward. We've shortened our program a bit this year. We have a great keynote speaker at lunch and then some tech talks following that. So we're going to invite everybody to get up, get your lunch, come back in about 10 minutes or 15 at the most. We're going to get our lunch speaker going. Thank you all for being here, and thanks again to the panel.